The third opera, composed by Edmund Graves, premiered on a Tuesday evening in April of 1814, to a house so full that the ushers had closed the upper gallery doors and turned away a dozen parties at the entrance. The candles along the proscenium arch threw a warm, unsteady light across the pit, and the orchestra tuned in the familiar key of Patient Disorder. And the season's most fashionable faces tilted toward one another in the gilded boxes above. In the last row of the second balcony, where the seats cost a shilling and the air carried the mingled smell of tallow and wet wool, Cecily Wren sat with her hands folded in her lap and listened to the overture she had finished writing 6 weeks ago. The descending phrase her father had taught her when she was 9 years old moved through the strings like a voice remembered from another room. She closed her eyes. She had not heard it played by a full orchestra before. Below and to the left, in the box draped in Harlow blue, Henry Ashworth, the 6th Duke of Harlow, held the printed score open across one knee and followed the notation with the tip of his gloved finger. He was 31, tall, composed in the manner of a man who had learned early that his face was watched and had decided to give it nothing. His jaw was set, his eyes moved not with the languid attention of a patron enduring his subscription, but with the close focus of someone who understood what the music was doing and wanted to know why. At the passage where the oboe line split and doubled back against itself in a figure that no English composer had attempted in a decade, his finger stopped. He looked up from the score. He did not look at the stage. He looked at the house. In the box beside his, the Dowager Duchess of Harlow, Lady Helena Ashworth, leaned toward Miss Arabella Fenton and said, in the voice she used when she wished to be overheard by precisely the right ears, "The Duke has engaged a music teacher for the spring. A Miss Wren, I am told. Some clergyman's daughter with no living family worth the name. She will tune the instruments and sit in the morning room and be grateful." Cecily heard the name. The strings carried the descending phrase into its resolution, and her hands tightened in her lap. And she did not turn her head. If you have ever sat in a crowded room and heard your own name spoken as though it belonged to no one, you may already know the particular quality of stillness that settled over her then. Stay close. This story remembers what that stillness cost. The applause, when it came, was generous. The season had decided that Edmund Graves was a talent of the first rank, a reclusive gentleman composer whose refusal to appear in public only deepened the fascination. 3 operas in 18 months, each more accomplished than the last, each delivered to Mr. Thorne at the Haymarket Theatre in a neat hand on cream paper, each signed with a name that did not belong to the woman who had written every note. Cecily had chosen the name from a headstone in a Suffolk churchyard. Edmund Graves, died 1741, beloved of no one in particular. It had seemed appropriate. A dead man could not be questioned. A dead man could not be denied a commission. A dead man's music could fill a theater without the inconvenience of belonging to a woman of 26, with ink on her fingers and a younger sister to feed. Lucy was 16 and sleeping in their lodgings in a street off Covent Garden that smelled of coal smoke and yesterday's fish. Lucy did not know the name Edmund Graves. She knew only that her older sister gave music lessons to the daughters of middling families during the day and sat up late at night with a candle and a pen, and that the rent was paid, and that the pianoforte in the corner of their single sitting room was the one thing Cecily had refused to sell after their father died. Their father, the Reverend George Wren, had been a man of modest living and immodest musical gifts. He had taught Cecily to read a score before she could read a sentence, had placed her hands on the keys of his church organ at the age of 5, and had spent every evening of her childhood working through the principles of composition at the kitchen table with a patience that never once acknowledged the strangeness of teaching a daughter what only sons were meant to learn. He died in the autumn of 1812, leaving behind £40 in savings, a parish that appointed his successor within the week, and a daughter whose education had fitted her for a world that did not exist. Cecily had sold the furniture. She had kept the pianoforte and the sheaf of her father's manuscripts, and the memory of his voice saying every evening, "Again, from the second bar, and this time listen to what the bass is doing." She had moved to London with Lucy, had found the lodgings, had placed advertisements for music instruction, and had sat one evening at the pianoforte with a blank sheet of paper and written the first act of an opera because she did not know how to stop being what her father had made her. The arrangement with Mr. Thorne had come about through a careful deception. Cecily had written to the theatre under the name Edmund Graves, had enclosed the completed first act, and had proposed terms. Thorne, who was a practical man with a theatre to fill, had agreed to £40 per completed work, paid in banknotes to a post office box. He had never asked to meet Edmund Graves in person. He had assumed, as everyone assumed, that the composer was a gentleman of independent means who preferred his privacy. Cecily had permitted the assumption. She had not corrected it. She could not afford to correct it. Because a woman who composed operas was not a composer. She was an oddity, a scandal, a creature the season would examine and set down, and Cecily needed the £40. She needed it the way a roof needs its last tile. The morning after the premiere, she walked to Thorne's office at the Haymarket to deliver the final corrections to the second act of her fourth opera. She carried the pages in a folio case under her arm, and she wore the gray dress she wore for lessons, and her shoes were worn at the heel in the particular way that shoes wear when their owner walks everywhere, because a carriage is an impossible luxury. The theatre was quiet at this hour. The lobby smelled of last night's candle wax and sawdust. She climbed the stair to Thorne's office and found the door open, and Thorne standing behind his desk with the expression of a man who has been cornered by someone he cannot refuse. The Duke of Harlow stood at the window. He was taller than he had appeared in the opera box, and broader through the shoulders, and he held a sheet of printed score in his left hand with the same close attention she had seen the night before. He wore dark blue. His cravat was plain. His face, in the gray morning light from the window, was still as carved stone, and his eyes were the color of smoke after rain. He did not smile. He did not turn when she entered. Not. He was reading the score. Thorne said, "Miss Wren, may I present His Grace, the Duke of Harlow? Your Grace, Miss Wren provides musical instruction to several families and has been of great assistance in transcription work for the theatre." The Duke did not respond to the introduction. He turned the page of the score. Then he turned it back. Then he looked at the folio case under Cecily's arm, and his gaze moved to her right hand, where the faint blue smudge of ink sat at the edge of her smallest finger, and something in his face changed. It was not a softening. It was a recognition, a narrowing of focus, the way a man recognizes a handwriting he has studied. "The corrections for the second act," Cecily said, and her voice was steady, and she placed the folio on Thorne's desk. "Sit down," the Duke said. His voice was low and level, a command issued without raising its volume. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace. I was only delivering papers for Mr. Thorne. I will not take your time. Sit down, Miss Wren." She sat. Her pulse was audible in her own ears. The Duke continued to look at the score, and then at the folio on the desk, and then at her hand. He said nothing further for a long moment. Then he folded the score, placed it inside his coat, and left without another word. Thorne exhaled as though he had been holding his breath for the duration of the visit. "He wishes to commission a private concert," Thorne said. "A new work by Edmund Graves to be performed at Harlow House. He is offering £200. £200, 5 times the usual fee. Enough to keep the lodgings for a year, to buy Lucy new shoes, to replace the candles she burned through every week. Cecily pressed her hands flat on her knees to keep them from shaking. Did he say why? He said the hand was unlike anything he had encountered. He said he had seen it before. Cecily walked home through streets still wet from the morning's rain. The folio case was empty under her arm. The commission settled into her thoughts the way a stone settles into a pond, slowly, displacing everything around it. 200 pounds. She could keep the lodgings through the winter. She could buy coal in advance, rather than by the scuttle. She could replace Lucy's shoes, which had worn through at the sole, and which Lucy had lined with folded newspaper without complaint. The way Lucy did everything without complaint. Because Lucy had learned very early that complaint was a luxury their household could not stock. At the lodgings, Cecily sat at the pianoforte and placed her hands on the keys and did not play. She was thinking about the Duke's hand on the score, the way his finger had traced the notation with the specificity of someone who had been trained. Patrons did not read scores that way. Patrons listened. This man read. The difference sat in her chest like a held note she could not resolve. 3 days later, the Duke appeared at the rooms where Cecily taught music on Tuesday afternoons. The house belonged to the Beresford family, and Mrs. Beresford had 2 daughters of moderate talent and immoderate enthusiasm, and the drawing room where Cecily gave lessons was a bright, cluttered space with a pianoforte that needed tuning and a window that overlooked the garden. Cecily was alone. The lesson had ended a quarter of an hour early because the younger Beresford girl had declared a headache, and Cecily had remained at the instrument to work through a passage in the Fourth Opera's 3rd act that she could not resolve. She did not hear him enter. She was deep inside the music, her fingers moving through the passage in the half-speed deliberation of composition rather than performance, stopping and returning and trying the phrase again with the bass line shifted. Her lips moved. She was singing the oboe part under her breath, testing it against the harmony. The gray dress was plain. Her hair was coming loose from its pins. The ink stain on her smallest finger had company now, a second smudge at the base of her thumb where the pen had slipped that morning. She played the passage through once more, and this time the resolution worked, and she exhaled and sat still with her hands resting on the keys. The Duke stood in the doorway. He had been there long enough to hear the passage played 3 times. His hand was at his breast pocket, where something small and flat pressed against the fabric of his coat. His face was still. His breathing had changed. Cecily turned and saw him, and stood so quickly that the bench scraped against the floor. "Your Grace, do not stop on my account," he said. And then, quietly, "That passage, the way the oboe doubles back, I have heard that construction before." "It is a common figure, Your Grace." "It is not." He was looking at her hands. "Sit down. Play it again." She sat. She played it again. And the Duke of Harlow stood in the doorway of the Beresford drawing room and listened with the focus of a man hearing something he had waited a very long time to hear, and Cecily did not understand what she was seeing in his face, because she had no category for it. She read it as the curiosity of a patron. She could not read it as anything else. A duke did not stand in a borrowed drawing room and listen to a music teacher with that quality of attention. It did not happen. The world in which it happened was not the world she lived in. In the weeks that followed, the Duke's deniable attention accumulated in small, precise deposits. He sent sheet music to her lodgings, old scores from the continent, compositions she had never seen. The first package arrived on a Thursday, carried by a footman who waited on the doorstep while Cecily unwrapped the brown paper and found a bound collection of Gluck's correspondence scores annotated in a hand she did not yet recognize. The second arrived the following Monday, accompanied by a note in that same precise hand requesting her opinion on a passage from a Viennese opera. She wrote her reply at the kitchen table after midnight, choosing her words with the same care she gave her compositions, and the footman returned for it at dawn. He arranged for her to have access to the Harlow Music Library, a room on the second floor of the great house in Mayfair, lined floor to ceiling with bound scores and manuscript collections that Cecily could have spent a lifetime reading. The first time she entered it, her breath left her. The room smelled of leather and old paper and beeswax, and the light came through tall windows that faced the garden. And there were more scores in this single room than she had seen in her entire life. She stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides and felt the weight of what had been available all this time to people who were not her. He was never present when she visited. He left notes in the margins of the scores she borrowed, written in a hand she came to recognize, precise and restrained and marked by the same trained notation she used herself. Once, beside a passage she had marked with a pencil question, he had written simply, "Yes, this is the right instinct." She had read those 5 words and pressed her thumb against the page and felt something move in her chest that she did not have permission to name. At the Hartwell Ball, on the 3rd Saturday of April, Lady Helena introduced Arabella Fenton to the assembled company, with the particular emphasis she reserved for candidates she had selected for the Duke's attention. Arabella was 20 and fair, and accomplished in precisely the ways the season valued, which is to say that she played the pianoforte beautifully and sang in French and watercolored flowers and had never once been asked whether she could read an orchestral score. She wore cream silk. Her diamonds were real. Cecily stood at the edge of the room in her gray dress and watched Lady Helena guide Arabella through the introductions and felt the precise weight of what she was not. Arabella paused beside a group that included Mrs. Beresford, and her voice carried, clear and bright and certain. "I understand the Duke has engaged a music teacher," Arabella said. "A Miss Wren. She gives lessons to tradesmen's children, I believe. How kind of His Grace to extend his charity." The words landed. Cecily felt them in her ribs. She turned toward the window, and her hand found the back of a chair, and she held it. Across the room, the Duke had been speaking to Lord Fairfax. He stopped mid-sentence. His gaze moved to Cecily, to her hand on the chair back, to the way her shoulders had set themselves against the room. He took a step toward her. He stopped himself. The step had been involuntary, and anyone who had been watching closely enough would have seen it. And 2 people had been watching closely enough. Lady Helena, who narrowed her eyes, and Cecily, who did not see it at all. Later that evening, as the guests moved toward the supper room, Cecily found herself standing near the entrance with no one to walk in with, and no intention of staying. She was reaching for her shawl when a voice behind her said, "You have not eaten." She turned. The Duke stood 3 paces away, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression giving nothing. "I am not hungry, Your Grace." "That was not what I asked. Come inside. Eat something." The command was plain. The tone was level. Cecily heard a patron issuing an instruction to a dependent and obeyed because the alternative was to explain, in a crowded hallway, why the words of a 20-year-old girl in cream silk had taken the appetite from her body. She walked into the supper room. She ate. The Duke did not sit with her. He stood across the room and spoke to Arabella's father about horses, and not once did his gaze move to where Cecily sat. And not once did Cecily notice that the plate of cold meats and bread that appeared at her place had been ordered by a man who was looking at horses and thinking about the music teacher who had not eaten. At the Harlow Music Library the following Tuesday, the Duke was present for the first time. He sat in the chair by the fire and said nothing, while Cecily examined a manuscript collection from 1790. After 20 minutes of silence, he spoke. My mother played. Cecily looked up from the manuscript. Lady Charlotte Ashworth. She composed. She was gifted in the way that your Edmund Graves is gifted, which is to say that the music she wrote was not decoration. It was architecture. He paused. His hand moved to his breast pocket and pressed against the flat shape there. My father forbade her from performing. He forbade her from publishing. He considered it unsuitable. She put her manuscripts in a drawer and closed it, and she did not open it again. The room was very quiet. A coal shifted in the grate. She died when I was 19. I found the manuscripts after the funeral. The drawer had not been opened in 11 years. His voice was level. The words issued with the discipline of a man who had rehearsed them into flatness so they would not break him. There was an unfinished work. The third act was incomplete. She had stopped at a passage where the oboe line doubles back against itself, in a figure I have never seen any other composer attempt. Cecily's breath caught. "Until last night," the Duke said. He looked at her. "Until last night, Miss Wren." He reached into his breast pocket and drew out a folded sheet of manuscript paper, yellowed with age, covered in a woman's hand. He did not unfold it. He held it between his fingers the way one holds a letter that has been read so many times the creases have gone soft. Then he placed it on the table beside Cecily's borrowed scores and left the room. Cecily sat alone in the Harlow Music Library and looked at the manuscript page and understood, for the first time, what the Duke of Harlow had been looking for in every score he had ever read. He had been looking for his mother's hand, and he had found it in hers. If this story has found you at a moment when your own work has gone unnamed, when the thing you do best is the thing the world has decided does not belong to you, you are not wrong to stay. The recognition this story owes is coming. It simply needs the room to arrive. The spring advanced. The commission for the private concert at Harlow House progressed. Cecily composed in the evenings and delivered pages to Thorne, and taught lessons in the mornings, and felt the Duke's deniable attention pressing against the edges of her life like warmth through a window she had not opened. He had not spoken of his mother again. He had not spoken of the manuscript page, which Cecily had returned to the library table where he had left it, and which had disappeared by her next visit. He issued his commands in the same low, level voice. "Eat something, Miss Wren. Come inside. The air is too cold. Stop working. It is past 9. She heard the commands. She did not hear the protection inside them. She heard a patron managing a resource. She could not afford to hear anything else. Lady Helena could hear it. Lady Helena, who had married the old Duke 3 years after Lady Charlotte's death, and had maintained the household's order with the confident precision of a woman who understood exactly which qualities the world required of a duchess, watched her stepson's attention settle on the music teacher and recognized it for what it was. She did not panic. She recalibrated. On the first day of May, Lady Helena called upon Cecily at her lodgings. The visit was brief. Lady Helena sat in the single chair, declined the offered tea, looked at the pianoforte and the ink-stained table and the stack of blank paper beside it, and said, "I understand that you correspond with Mr. Thorne at the Haymarket regarding the works of Edmund Graves." Cecily went very still. "You deliver manuscripts in your own hand. You correct proofs. You receive payment." Lady Helena folded her gloved hands. "I am not a fool, Miss Wren. I know what you are." The room contracted. Lucy was at her lesson. The street noise from below was distant and irrelevant. Cecily said nothing. If the season were to learn that Edmund Graves is not a gentleman composer, but a clergyman's daughter who gives lessons for a shilling, the scandal would consume the Haymarket and every family who has patronized the work. The Duke's own reputation as patron would suffer. You understand this? I understand it, Your Grace. Good. Lady Helena stood. You will withdraw from the commission at Harlow House. You will cease your visits to the Harlow Music Library. You will write a letter to Mr. Thorne informing him that Edmund Graves has retired from composition. And you will do this within the week, or I will inform the season myself. She paused at the door. You are a music teacher, Miss Wren. That is what you are. It is what you have always been. And it is all you will ever be. The door closed. Cecily stood in the middle of the room and pressed her hands flat against the table where she composed, and the ink smelled of iron, and the paper was still warm from the morning's work. And she did not cry. She breathed. She stood there and breathed, and felt the edges of the world she had built. The thin, careful, secret world of Edmund Graves begin to crack. Lucy came home an hour later, with flour on her sleeve from the baker's, where she had been buying the day-old bread they could afford. She set the loaf on the table and looked at her sister's face, and did not ask. Lucy was 16, and she had learned the shape of trouble in Cecily's posture, the way other girls learned needlework, by long practice and close attention. She cut the bread. She set a piece beside the manuscript pages. She sat on the floor by the pianoforte and read her book and waited. Cecily ate the bread. She picked up her pen. She wrote 3 bars of the Fourth Opera's finale with a hand that shook only slightly, and the notes were precise, and the harmony was clean, and the descending phrase sat in its proper place, and Lucy heard her sister's breathing steady, and did not look up from her book. That evening, a footman delivered a note to her lodgings in the Duke's hand. It read, "The concert is arranged for the 14th of May. Thorne expects the completed score by the 10th. Nothing more. No mention of the library visits. No mention of his mother's manuscript. No warmth. No protection." Cecily read the note, and read it again, and placed it on the pianoforte, and sat before the keys and did not play. Lady Helena had been to see him. She was certain of it. He had been told what she was, and he had responded with a note about a deadline. The commands had stopped. The sheet music had stopped. The margin notes had stopped. She was, once more, invisible. 3 days before the concert, at a supper given by the Beresfords, a Mrs. Langley leaned toward Cecily during the fish course and said, with the practiced concern of a woman delivering information she knows will wound, "I heard the Dowager Duchess mention you at Lady Fairfax's luncheon yesterday. She told the table, 'The music teacher has confused attention for affection, as her sort so often do.' I thought you should know, my dear. It is always better to know." The music teacher. The label landed for the 3rd time, in the 3rd setting, and this time, Cecily felt it settle into her bones with the weight of something final. She set her fork down. She folded her napkin. She excused herself and walked home through streets she did not see, and when she arrived at the lodgings, she sat at the pianoforte and placed her hands on the keys and played the descending phrase her father had taught her, the phrase that opened every work she had ever written, the phrase that a dead woman named Charlotte Ashworth had also known, and she played it until her fingers ached. She did not withdraw from the commission. She did not write the letter Lady Helena had demanded. She sat at the pianoforte that night and played through everything she had written for the Harlow concert, from the opening bars to the unfinished finale, and she played it with the concentration of a woman who is deciding something. The lodgings were cold. The candle was guttering. Lucy had gone to bed. Cecily played until her fingers ached, and then she picked up her pen and finished the score in a single sitting that lasted until the sky turned gray outside the window. She delivered the completed manuscript to Thorne on the morning of the 10th, with steady hands and ink on both of them. Thorne looked at her face and asked if she was well, and she said she was, and she did not tell him about Lady Helena's visit, because the telling would have made it real in a way the silence did not. She told Lucy to press the gray dress. She told herself that the music was the thing that mattered, that it had always been the thing that mattered, and that if the season heard it performed at Harlow House under the name of a dead man from a Suffolk churchyard, it would still be hers. Even unnamed, it would still be hers. The evening of the 14th of May was mild and clear. Harlow House blazed with candles. The guests filled the music room, a long gallery with tall windows and a painted ceiling, and an acoustic so pure that a whispered word at one end could be heard at the other. Lady Helena stood at the entrance in emerald silk and received the guests with the composure of a woman who controlled the evening and knew it. Arabella Fenton stood beside her in white, positioned where the Duke would see her first when he entered. The orchestra tuned. The printed programs read, in gold letters, a new work by Edmund Graves, commissioned by His Grace the Duke of Harlow. Cecily sat in the last row. She wore the gray dress. Her hands were in her lap. She had come because the music was hers, and she could not stay away from it. And she had come because she was not yet willing to let Lady Helena's verdict be the final one. And she had come because some part of her, the part that lived below language, in the place where breath quickened and hands steadied themselves on chairbacks, needed to know whether the Duke of Harlow had heard what she heard in his silence, or whether she had invented it. The Duke entered the gallery. He did not look at Arabella. He did not look at Lady Helena. He walked the length of the room, past the seated guests, past the orchestra, past the empty chair reserved for the patron, and stopped in front of Cecily Wren. The room went quiet. Not the gradual quiet of a conversation winding down, but the abrupt held breath quiet of 100 people realizing simultaneously that something is happening they had not anticipated. "Stand up, Miss Wren," he said. His voice was low. It carried. She stood. Her pulse was a drum in her throat. She did not understand what was happening. He turned to the room. His face was composed. His voice was level. He spoke as a man speaks when he is making a declaration he has considered for weeks and will not retract. "Miss Wren is Edmund Graves, and she will be my Duchess." 12 words. They fell into the silence the room had built, and the silence held them, and the room did not move. Lady Helena's hand went to the pearls at her throat. Arabella's composure cracked along a line that ran from her mouth to her eyes. Mrs. Beresford pressed her hand to her chest. Lord Fairfax set down his glass. A murmur began at the edges of the gallery and moved inward, voice by voice, face by face, the season recalibrating what it knew. Lady Helena stepped forward. "Henry, this is not the occasion for such a declaration. Miss Wren is a music teacher. She is not suited to the position you describe. You will withdraw this claim and we will discuss it privately." The Duke looked at his stepmother. His voice did not rise. She composed 3 operas that filled the Haymarket for 18 months. She composed the work this orchestra is about to perform. She did it under a dead man's name because the world you have maintained would not permit a woman to do what she does. I will not withdraw. He paused. I will not discuss it privately. Lady Helena's mouth opened. It closed. She looked at the room, at the 100 faces watching her, and for the first time since Cecily had known her, the Dowager Duchess of Harlow had nothing to say. Her posture, which had never wavered in any drawing room Cecily had seen, shifted. Her shoulders drew inward. She stepped back. It was not a retreat. It was a recognition, extracted in public from a woman who had believed her categories were permanent. Mr. Thorne, who had been standing near the orchestra with the expression of a man watching his life's most profitable arrangement, collapse and reform in front of him, cleared his throat. "I can confirm," he said, and his voice was steady if somewhat dazed, "that every manuscript delivered under the name Edmund Graves was written in Miss Wren's hand. I have the correspondence. The payments were made to her account." The murmur in the gallery became a sound Cecily had not expected. It became warmth. Mrs. Beresford was smiling. Lord Fairfax was nodding. A woman Cecily did not know was wiping her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The season, which had decided 6 weeks ago that Cecily Wren was a music teacher and nothing more, was deciding something else now, and the decision was moving through the room like candlelight. Cecily looked at the Duke. His face had not changed. His composure had not broken. He stood in the center of the gallery he had been born to occupy and waited for her to speak. And his eyes, which were the color of smoke after rain, held the quiet certainty of a man who had known what he was going to do since the morning he stood in Thorne's office and saw the ink on her smallest finger. "Your Grace," Cecily said. Her voice was barely audible. "You kept your mother's manuscript." "Yes." "The unfinished third act." "Yes." "Why?" "Because someone should have heard it." His voice, for the first time, was not quite level. "Because someone should have said her name in a room full of people and told them what she was." Cecily's eyes filled. She did not look away from him. She did not reach for his hand. She stood in the gray dress, with the ink on her fingers, and the worn shoes, and the descending phrase still sounding somewhere in the architecture of her chest, and she said, "Then I will finish it." The Duke offered his hand. She took it. The gallery, which had been holding its breath, exhaled. 3 weeks after the concert at Harlow House, on an evening in early June when the light lasted until nearly 10, and the air through the open window of the music room smelled of the lime trees in the Harlow garden, Cecily sat at the pianoforte and played through the final passage of Lady Charlotte Ashworth's unfinished opera. She had completed the third act. She had written the resolution the dead woman's music had been reaching toward, the phrase that climbed where the original had descended, the harmony that opened where the original had closed. The descending figure was there. It would always be there. It was the thread that connected a church organist in Suffolk to a silence duchess in Mayfair, to a woman in a gray dress who had refused to stop composing. The Duke sat in the chair by the fire. Lucy sat on the floor beside him with a book she was not reading, watching her sister with the expression of a girl who has recently learned something about the world that has made it larger. The manuscript page, the yellowed sheet from Lady Charlotte's drawer, sat on the pianoforte beside Cecily's new pages. 2 hands. 2 women. 1 phrase. Cecily played the final chord and let it ring. The candles flickered. The lime trees moved outside the window. The room held the sound the way a cupped hand holds water, gently, with the knowledge that it will pass through. The Duke did not speak. He did not need to. His hand rested on the arm of the chair, and his face for once was not composed. It was open. The stillness that had lived in it since the day Cecily first saw him in the opera box had changed its quality. It was no longer the stillness of a man withholding. It was the stillness of a man who had found what he was listening for. On the pianoforte, beside the new manuscript and the old one, a candle burned down to its base, and guttered and steadied and burned on. Cecily rested her hands on the keys. The evening was quiet. The music had been heard. The name it belonged to was at last her own. Thank you for staying until the end. If Cecily's story moved you, leave the name of the moment that stayed with you, and come back soon. There will be another story waiting.